on the evening of December 16, 1985, a black Lincoln sedan pulled to the curb on East 46th Street in Manhattan, directly outside a steakhouse called Sparks. Three men in white trench coats and black fur hats were already standing on the sidewalk. What happened next lasted roughly 8 seconds. When it was over, the boss of the largest organized crime family in the United States was dead, on a Midtown pavement in the middle of rush hour, and according to sworn federal testimony, the man who ordered it was sitting in a car half a block away, watching it happen. To understand why Paul Castellano was killed that evening, you have to understand what December of 1985 looked like from inside the American Mafia. The federal government was, for the first time in its history, winning. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, signed into law in 1970, had finally been turned into a working weapon by federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. In February of 1985, a federal grand jury had returned an indictment against the entire ruling body of the American Mafia. It became known as the Commission Case, and it named the bosses of New York's 5 families as defendants in a single racketeering enterprise. Paul Castellano was one of those defendants. He was also, at that moment, on trial in a separate federal racketeering case in Manhattan, sitting in a courtroom day after day, while the government played tape recordings the FBI had made inside his own home. He was 70 years old. He was the boss of the Gambino family, by the FBI's own assessment, the largest and wealthiest organized crime family in the country, with roughly 300 formally initiated members and thousands of associates. And he was, according to the men who worked underneath him, more isolated from his own organization than any boss in the family's history. Constantino Paul Castellano was born in Brooklyn on June 26, 1915, the son of a butcher who was himself connected to the early Mangano organization. He never finished school. He went into meat. That detail matters more than it sounds. Castellano's power was built on legitimate commerce and the corruption of it. As Selwyn Raab documents in 5 Families, Castellano's holdings ran through meat wholesaling, poultry distribution, construction, concrete, private carting, and the labor unions attached to all of them. He was a boss who thought like a businessman, and he ran the family the way a chairman runs a conglomerate, from a distance, from a 20-room house on Tot Hill in Staten Island, that the FBI and the press both took to calling the White House. The federal record gives the scale of it. Castellano's poultry distribution business supplied supermarket chains across the New York metropolitan area. His interests in the concrete and construction trades meant that, as federal indictments in the mid-1980s established, no significant concrete pour in Manhattan, above a certain dollar value, happened without the families taking a percentage off the top. The private carting industry, the collection of commercial garbage across New York City, was organized as a cartel that assigned customers to companies and punished anyone who competed on price. Every one of those arrangements was, in the end, enforced by the threat of violence. Castellano did not personally carry out that violence. He did not have to. That was the point of the structure. He got the job because of blood. Carlo Gambino, who had run the family since 1957, was Castellano's cousin and his brother-in-law. When Gambino died of natural causes in October of 1976, he passed the family to Castellano rather than to Agnello Della Croce, the underboss who commanded the loyalty of the family's street crews. Della Croce accepted the arrangement and stayed on as underboss. That decision held the family together for 9 years. It also split it in half, Castellano's side, in the boardrooms and the union halls, and Della Croce's side, in the social clubs of Ozone Park and Little Italy. 2 things broke that arrangement in 1985. The first was narcotics. The family had a standing rule against heroin trafficking. As Anthony DeStefano and other historians have documented, was enforced less as a matter of morality than as a matter of federal exposure, because narcotics convictions carried sentences long enough to make men cooperate. In the early 1980s, the FBI recorded conversations inside the home of Angelo Ruggiero, a member of the Bergen crew in Queens. Those recordings captured discussion of heroin dealing. Castellano demanded the transcripts. The men on the tapes understood what that meant. Agnello Della Croce died on December 2, 1985. He was the only figure in the family with the standing to protect the street faction from the boss. Castellano did not attend the wake, an omission that was read, correctly, as contempt. Within days, he named Thomas Bellotti as his new underboss. Bellotti was his driver and his closest loyalist, and everyone in the family understood the message. The Queen's crews were about to be broken up and reassigned. 14 days after Della Croce's death, Paul Castellano was dead too. The most complete account of what happened on East 46th Street comes from Salvatore Gravano, who was a member of the Gambino family at the time, who later became its underboss, and who in 1991 became a federal cooperating witness. His account was given under oath in federal court and set out at length in Peter Maas's book, Underboss. It has been corroborated in its essentials by the FBI's own investigation and by the federal jury that ultimately accepted it. According to that testimony, the plan was built around a dinner. Castellano was scheduled to meet several senior men at Sparks Steakhouse at 5 o'clock in the evening. One of the men expected at that table, Frank DeCicco, was part of the plot. The location was chosen deliberately, a busy commercial street at rush hour, in the middle of Manhattan, where a boss with a federal trial in progress would not be traveling with armed protection, because armed protection meant a weapons charge. The team was assembled in the days beforehand. The shooters were positioned along the north side of 46th Street, near the restaurant entrance. They wore white trench coats and black fur hats, not for disguise, but so that they could identify one another instantly in a crowd, and so that witnesses would remember the coats instead of the faces. A backup team was placed nearby. Radios were used. And in a car parked across 3rd Avenue, John Gotti and Salvatore Gravano sat and waited. The traffic on 46th Street that evening was what it always is, in Midtown Manhattan, 8 days before Christmas. The sidewalks were full. The restaurant was full. Gravano testified that the team had walked the block in advance, that they knew which direction the car would approach from, and that they knew Castellano would be dropped at the door rather than parking, because a 70-year-old man on trial in federal court does not walk 2 blocks in December. At approximately 5:26 p.m., the Lincoln reached the curb. Thomas Bellotti was driving. Castellano was in the passenger seat. He opened his door and began to step out onto the sidewalk. The men in the trench coats closed on the car from both sides. Castellano was shot 6 times at close range and died in the doorway of the vehicle, half in and half out. Bellotti stepped out of the driver's side, into the street, and was shot 4 times. He died on the asphalt beside the car. Neither man drew a weapon. Neither man was armed. The shooters walked east, toward 2nd Avenue, and were gone within seconds. Gravano testified that he and Gotti drove slowly past the scene on their way out, close enough to see the bodies. There were no arrests that night. There were dozens of witnesses on one of the busiest streets in Manhattan at the height of the evening rush, and not one of them stopped the men in the white coats. The federal response to the killing tells you as much about the era as the killing itself. Castellano's death removed him from 2 federal prosecutions at once. He had been a defendant in the commission case, and he was in the middle of a separate racketeering trial in Manhattan, built substantially on recordings the FBI had made inside his Staten Island home in 1983, recordings that captured the ordinary business of a criminal enterprise conducted in a kitchen. Both cases proceeded without him. The commission case went to trial in the autumn of 1986 and produced convictions in November of that year, with the ruling bosses of the Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families each sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. Castellano, had he lived, would in all likelihood have been sitting in that same courtroom. The murder on 46th Street was not prosecuted for 6.5 years. The FBI's Gambino squad rebuilt the case from the inside. Beginning in 1989, agents recorded conversations in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, where John Gotti conducted family business in the belief that he was beyond surveillance. Those recordings were the government's instrument. In December of 1990, Gotti, Salvatore Gravano, and Frank Locascio were arrested together and charged under RICO. In November of 1991, after hearing the government's tapes, Gravano agreed to cooperate. He testified in federal court in Brooklyn in March of 1992. On April 2, 1992, in United States v. Gotti, a federal jury convicted John Gotti on 13 counts of racketeering, including the murders of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti. On June 23, 1992, he was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. 2 men were killed outside Sparks Steakhouse. The historical record has always concentrated on one of them. Thomas Bellotti was 45 years old. He had been the underboss of the Gambino family for roughly 2 weeks. According to the testimony given in federal court, he was not the target of the operation in any meaningful sense. He was killed because he was in the car, because he was loyal, and because leaving him alive would have meant leaving a war behind. He was survived by a wife and children who were not part of any of it. Castellano was survived by a wife and children as well. This is what the documented record of organized crime looks like when you strip the film scores out of it. 2 men shot dead on a public street at rush hour, and 2 families left behind. And there is a second set of victims in this story, who never appear in the photographs from 46th Street. The enterprise Paul Castellano ran for 9 years was not an abstraction. It took a percentage from every cubic yard of concrete poured into the buildings of Manhattan, and that percentage was paid by the people who lived and worked in those buildings. It took its cut of the commercial garbage collected from restaurants and shops across 5 boroughs, and that cut was paid by the owners of those businesses, who had no alternative supplier to call. Contractors who refused were driven out. Union members whose locals were controlled paid dues into funds they did not govern. Federal prosecutors spent the better part of 2 decades documenting exactly how much that cost the city, and the answer ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The retaliation came 4 months later. The rules of the commission, established in 1931, required that the killing of a boss be sanctioned by the commission itself. This one had not been. On April 13, 1986, a car bomb detonated in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, killing Frank DeCicco, the man who had helped bring Castellano to that dinner reservation, and who by then was John Gotti's underboss. A bystander was seriously injured. Historians and federal investigators, drawing on later cooperator testimony, have documented that the bomb was retaliation from within the Mafia itself for the unsanctioned murder of a sitting boss, and the Gambino family, the largest and wealthiest criminal organization in the United States, never recovered. The killing on 46th Street brought it a leader who liked cameras, and the cameras brought the federal government. John Gotti was formally installed as boss at a meeting of the family's captains in January of 1986. For the next 4 years, he was acquitted in 3 separate criminal trials, and the New York press supplied him with a nickname to match. The nickname did not survive the tapes. The recordings from above the Ravenite Social Club, made while Gotti spoke freely about the business of the family, gave federal prosecutors the case they had not been able to build in the streets. Gravano's testimony supplied the rest. Gotti served the remainder of his life in federal custody, much of it in near-total isolation at the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. He died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002, at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old, and he had been boss of the Gambino family for 6 years and a federal prisoner for 11. Salvatore Gravano admitted under oath to participating in 19 murders. He was sentenced in 1994 to 5 years in federal prison. He was arrested again in 2000 in Arizona for running a large-scale narcotics operation, pleaded guilty, and served the majority of the 2 decades that followed behind bars. Of the men who stood on that sidewalk, in the trench coats and the fur hats, most did not live out the decade in freedom either. That is not a moral. It is simply what the record shows. How do historians document this today? Selwyn Raab in 5 Families treats the Castellano killing as the pivot on which the modern history of the American Mafia turns. The moment a family with a functioning corporate structure traded it for a boss who did not understand what the FBI had become. Peter Maas's underboss preserves the operational account from the man who helped plan it. Federal prosecutors have made essentially the same argument in open court, that the murder of Paul Castellano was not a display of strength but the beginning of the collapse, because it broke the Commission's own rules, invited internal retaliation, and drew the full weight of federal attention onto the one family that had until then been the most careful. It bears stating plainly that the men of organized crime represented a tiny criminal minority within the Italian-American community of their era. The broader community built American cities, served in 2 world wars, founded major industries, and has nothing whatever to do with the conduct documented in this episode. The men who died outside Sparks Steakhouse and the men who killed them do not speak for anyone but themselves. 8 seconds on a Manhattan sidewalk, in the last light of a December afternoon. That is all it took to end the reign of the most commercially successful boss the American Mafia ever produced. What the record shows is not a story about power. It is a story about an organization that could not solve a succession dispute without killing 2 men in front of 100 witnesses, and that destroyed itself in the process. The federal government did not have to break the Gambino family that evening. The family made a start on it themselves. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The Five Families Files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. Sources for everything covered tonight are in the description. This has been the Five Families Files, 2 cells. Good night from the archive.